I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I represented myself. My husband laughed when he saw me stand alone at the table. His lawyer laughed too. Even the room seemed to agree. I let them. Then I spoke. And after my first sentence, the courtroom froze. My name is Rachel Monroe. And before I go any further, if stories about quiet strength, patience, and women who were underestimated matter to you, please subscribe to this channel because every story here is about what happens when silence finally becomes strategy. And before the story truly begins, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from right now? Now listen carefully because everything you're about to hear happened in open court, and none of it was accidental. The day of my divorce hearing, I walked into the courthouse alone. No briefcase. No legal team. No confident stride meant to impress anyone. Just a thin folder under my arm and a calm I had practiced for months. Across the room, my husband, Daniel Monroe, sat beside his attorney, Victor Lang. Perfectly tailored suit, polished shoes, the posture of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. When he saw me walk in without a lawyer, he didn't even try to hide his smile. He leaned toward Victor and whispered something that made him chuckle. I heard it anyway. She couldn't even afford counsel. A few people in the gallery nodded quietly, sympathy mixed with judgment. The judge, Judge Elaine Patterson, adjusted her glasses and looked at me with polite concern. Ms. Monroe, she said, are you certain you wish to proceed without representation? Her tone was kind, but doubtful. Yes, Your Honor, I replied calmly. Daniel let out a short laugh before he could stop himself. Victor stood and cleared his throat. For the record, Your Honor, my client finds it unfortunate that Ms. Monroe has chosen to proceed this way, but we're prepared. Prepared. That word echoed in my mind. Because I was prepared too, just not in the way anyone expected. As the hearing began, Victor wasted no time painting a picture of me as unstable, emotional, financially irresponsible, a woman who had depended entirely on her husband and now wanted more than she deserved. He mentioned my empty bank accounts, my lack of counsel, my poor judgment. Daniel sat back, arms crossed, enjoying every second of it. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked at the judge and said, before we discuss assets, I'd like to clarify who is currently under oath. The room shifted. Judge Patterson blinked once. Mr. Monroe is. I nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Daniel's smile tightened. Victor frowned slightly, confused. I continued, my voice steady. Then I'd like to begin with a few questions for my husband about the financial statements he submitted. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel leaned forward, confidence still intact. He thought this was where I embarrassed myself. He thought my lack of a lawyer meant lack of preparation. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that I hadn't come to court to win sympathy. I had come to put the truth on the record and let him destroy himself with his own words. Daniel didn't hesitate when I began questioning him. He leaned back in his chair like this was entertainment. Victor smiled faintly, already preparing to object, already convinced I didn't know the rules well enough to matter. I asked my first question slowly, clearly. Mr. Monroe, you submitted a sworn financial statement to this court on March 12th, correct? Yes, Daniel replied easily. And that statement was signed under penalty of perjury? He nodded. Of course. I let a small pause settle, not for drama, but to let the weight of the words land. Then I'd like to confirm, I said, that the document lists every account, trust, and asset you control, directly or indirectly. Victor stood immediately. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Patterson raised a hand. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Monroe. Daniel's smile returned. Yes. Everything is listed. I glanced down at my folder, then back up. Including accounts opened after our separation? Yes. Including accounts held in third-party entities? Yes. including any transfers made in anticipation of this hearing? Daniel exhaled, amused. Yes. A few people in the gallery shifted. Victor frowned. I nodded once, like I was satisfied. Then I asked, Mr. Monroe, are you familiar with the term post-separation transfer? Victor jumped in. Your Honor. Judge Patterson looked at him. Let her finish. Daniel shrugged. Sure. It's when assets move after a couple separates. Correct, I said. And those transfers must be disclosed, correct? Yes. I took another pause. This one longer. Then please explain, I continued, why the account ending in 4872 is not included in your filing. Daniel blinked. Just once. Victor froze. That account doesn't exist, Daniel said quickly. I lifted a single page from my folder and handed it to the bailiff. Bank confirmation, Your Honor. Opened 6 weeks after our separation. Judge Patterson studied the page. Daniel leaned forward. That's not mine. Then whose is it? I asked. Victor objected again, louder this time. Speculation. Overruled. Daniel hesitated. And the room felt it. It belongs to a holding company, he said. And who controls that holding company? I asked. Silence. Daniel glanced at Victor. Victor shook his head slightly. I do, Daniel said finally. The courtroom shifted. I didn't smile. I didn't press yet. Instead, I asked gently, and did you disclose that account? No. A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Patterson leaned forward. Mr. Monroe, you just testified that everything was disclosed. Daniel swallowed. Victor stood again. Your Honor, my client may have misunderstood the question earlier. I looked at the judge calmly. May I continue? She nodded. I placed the page back in my folder. Mr. Monroe, this court offered me time to hire a lawyer today. Daniel smirked. Yes. I declined, I said, because I needed you to answer questions without filters. Victor's face hardened. I continued, voice steady. Now I'd like to ask about the second account. Daniel's confidence wavered, just enough, because he was beginning to understand something he'd missed. I wasn't here because I was broke. I was here because the truth comes out faster when people believe you're harmless. And as I turned the page, ready to reveal the next transfer, I saw it clearly. This wasn't a divorce anymore. It was a record. The second account was where the air in the room truly changed. Not loudly, but sharply, like a breath caught in the throat. Mr. Monroe, I said, keeping my voice even, you testified that the account ending in 4872 was the only undisclosed holding. Daniel nodded a little too fast. Yes. And you're certain? I continued. There are no others? Victor shifted in his seat, fingers tapping once against the table. Daniel glanced at him, then back at me. I'm certain. I opened my folder again, slower this time, letting the pause stretch just enough to be uncomfortable. Then let's talk about Monroe Consulting Group, I said. Victor stood instantly. Objection, relevance. Judge Patterson didn't even look up. Overruled. Daniel's jaw tightened. That company doesn't hold marital assets. I didn't ask that, I replied gently. I asked if you were familiar with it. Yes, he said. I am. And you're listed as the managing member? Yes. And Monroe Consulting Group opened an operating account 3 months after our separation? Daniel hesitated. Just long enough. Yes, he said. I nodded once. And funds were transferred into that account from your primary investment portfolio. That's standard business practice. Victor snapped. Judge Patterson raised a hand. Mr. Lang. I looked back at Daniel. How much was transferred? Daniel cleared his throat. I don't recall the exact amount. That's understandable, I said softly. I do. I handed another document to the bailiff. $742,000. A ripple of sound moved through the gallery. Daniel's face lost color. Victor leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Daniel didn't respond. Mr. Monroe, I continued, did you disclose that transfer? No, he said quietly. And why not? Victor stood again. Your Honor. Judge Patterson's voice cut through the room. Sit down, Mr. Lang. Victor sat. Daniel swallowed. It wasn't relevant. I tilted my head slightly. Relevant to whom? Silence. I stepped back from the table, letting the moment breathe. Your Honor, I said, this pattern repeats. Daniel looked up sharply. Multiple accounts, I continued, opened after separation, funded by marital assets, undisclosed in sworn statements. Judge Patterson leaned forward. Ms. Monroe, are you alleging concealment? Yes, I answered without hesitation. Daniel scoffed weakly. This is ridiculous. She's misinterpreting routine transfers. I met his eyes. Then routine should be easy to explain. I turned another page. And now, I said calmly, I'd like to introduce an internal email. Victor's head snapped up. What email? The one sent from Mr. Monroe to his financial advisor, I replied, 6 days after our separation. Daniel shook his head. That email is privileged. It's not, I said quietly. It was forwarded. Judge Patterson looked at me. Forwarded to whom? I lifted my eyes. To me. The courtroom froze. Daniel stared, stunned. Victor whispered, Daniel, what did you send? I handed the email to the bailiff. In it, Mr. Monroe writes, and I quote, move anything that could look bad before court. A sharp intake of breath echoed from somewhere behind me. Judge Patterson read the page slowly. Very slowly. Daniel leaned forward, voice rising. That's out of context. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Because the context was about to get much worse. I closed my folder gently and looked at the judge. Your Honor, before we continue, I paused. May I request that all testimony from this point forward be taken under heightened scrutiny for potential concealment and coercion? The room went dead silent. Judge Patterson lifted her gaze to Daniel. And in that moment, I saw it. The exact second my husband realized this wasn't about money anymore. It was about intent. And once intent enters the record, everything changes. Judge Patterson leaned forward and said, Ms. Monroe, explain coercion. Judge Patterson's question didn't sound angry. It sounded careful. Ms. Monroe, she said slowly, explain coercion. Daniel turned toward Victor immediately, panic flashing across his face before he could hide it. Victor leaned in, whispering urgently, but I didn't look at either of them. I kept my eyes on the judge. Yes, Your Honor, I said steady. Coercion doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like control dressed up as concern. The courtroom stayed silent. I continued. During our marriage, Mr. Monroe controlled every account, every password, every financial decision. When I questioned transfers, I was told I didn't understand money. When I asked for access, I was told I was being emotional. Daniel shook his head slightly. That's not true. Judge Patterson raised a hand. Mr. Monroe, you'll have your turn. I opened my folder again, slower now, deliberate. I'd like to submit a series of messages sent by Mr. Monroe to me over the last 18 months. Victor stood. Objection. Relevance. They go directly to motive. I replied calmly. Judge Patterson nodded. Admitted. I read the first message out loud. You don't need to worry about finances. I'll handle that. You tend to get confused. A few heads lifted in the gallery. The second message followed. If you start asking questions, it'll just make things harder for you in court. Daniel shifted in his seat. And the third, I said quietly, was sent 2 weeks before our separation. I paused. Then read it. If this ends up in front of a judge, remember who actually pays the bills. The silence that followed felt heavy. Judge Patterson leaned back slightly. Mr. Monroe, she said, did you send these messages? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but they're being taken out of context. I didn't argue. Instead, I turned one more page. Your Honor, I said, context matters. That's why I'd like to introduce a document Mr. Monroe signed 5 years ago. Victor stiffened. It's a financial authorization, I continued, granting me access to all accounts in the event of marital breakdown. Daniel's head snapped up. That was never meant to be used. But it was signed, I said gently. Judge Patterson studied the document. Mr. Monroe, why was this authorization never honored? Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. Victor stood quickly. Your Honor, this is becoming a character assassination. Judge Patterson's voice hardened. No, Mr. Lang. This is becoming a pattern. I took a slow breath. Your Honor, I didn't represent myself because I couldn't afford a lawyer. Daniel scoffed weakly. I represented myself, I continued, because I needed Mr. Monroe to believe I was powerless. The room shifted. Judge Patterson looked directly at me. And why would that matter? I met her gaze. Because people lie more freely when they think no one is watching. Daniel leaned forward, voice tight. This is manipulation. I nodded once. Yes. A ripple of shock moved through the room. It's called strategy, I said calmly. And it worked. Judge Patterson lowered her eyes to the documents again. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Because in that moment, the illusion he'd built for years was gone. And what stood in its place was something far more dangerous to him. A woman who had planned this ending, long before he ever laughed. Judge Patterson closed the file and said, Mr. Monroe, the court has questions about intent. Judge Patterson didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Monroe, she said calmly, the court has questions about intent. Daniel straightened in his chair, forcing a smile that didn't quite hold. Your Honor, I think this is being exaggerated. My wife is clearly emotional. This is a divorce, not a criminal trial. I stayed silent. That silence did more than any objection. Judge Patterson turned to him. Intent determines credibility. Credibility determines outcomes. So, let's be precise. Victor leaned forward. Your Honor, with respect, Ms. Monroe is attempting to turn routine marital disagreements into allegations of misconduct. The judge looked at me. Ms. Monroe, do you wish to respond? Yes, I said, standing again. I didn't rush. I didn't glance at Daniel. Your Honor, I began. Intent is proven by patterns, not by excuses. I lifted a single page from my folder. I'd like to introduce a timeline. Victor scoffed quietly. A timeline? Yes, I replied. Of events that occurred after our separation, but before this hearing. Judge Patterson nodded. Proceed. I walked the court through it carefully, one point at a time. Dates. Transfers. Messages. Each one connected to the next like links in a chain that could no longer be broken. March 18th, I said, Mr. Monroe moved funds into a holding account. March 20th, he sent an email instructing his advisor to clean things up. March 21st, he told me I didn't need access because I got overwhelmed. Daniel shook his head. That's not what I meant. I looked at him then. Then explain what you meant. Victor stood. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Patterson didn't look at him. Overruled. Daniel opened his mouth and closed it again. I continued, my voice steady. Your Honor, I want the court to note something important. I was never told about these accounts. I was never given access. And when I asked questions, I was discouraged from asking more. Because you didn't understand finance, Daniel snapped, irritation slipping through. The judge's eyes sharpened. Mr. Monroe, be careful. I nodded slightly. That statement, Your Honor, that's intent. Victor turned toward Daniel, whispering urgently now, no longer confident, no longer amused. Judge Patterson leaned forward. Ms. Monroe, are you suggesting your husband intentionally concealed assets while preparing for litigation? Yes, I answered. And that he relied on my perceived ignorance to do it. Daniel laughed once, sharp and defensive. This is absurd. If she were so capable, she wouldn't be standing here without a lawyer. I met his eyes. I'm standing here without a lawyer, I said calmly, because lawyers interrupt. A ripple moved through the courtroom. I needed Mr. Monroe to speak freely, I continued. And he did. Judge Patterson glanced down at the stack of documents, then back at Daniel. Mr. Monroe, you testified earlier that you disclosed everything voluntarily. Yes, he said quickly. She lifted one page. Then why did you only acknowledge these accounts after being confronted? Daniel swallowed. I forgot. The word echoed. Weak. Exposed. I closed my folder gently. Your Honor, I'd like to ask one final question. Judge Patterson nodded. Go ahead. I turned to Daniel, my voice quiet now. When you told me I was too confused to handle money, were you protecting me? Or protecting yourself? The courtroom held its breath. Daniel stared at me, panic rising, his mouth opening as if the right answer might still save him. And, in that moment, before he said a single word, I saw it clearly. The truth had finally cornered him, and whatever he said next would decide everything. Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. The pause stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the courtroom to feel it, long enough for Judge Patterson to lift her eyes and wait without rescuing him. Answer the question, Mr. Monroe, she said evenly. Daniel cleared his throat. I was trying to keep things simple, he replied. Rachel gets anxious about finances. I didn't want to overwhelm her. I nodded once, as if that made sense. Your Honor, I said. May I respond? Judge Patterson gestured. Briefly. Mr. Monroe is correct about one thing, I said calmly. I do get anxious when information is withheld. A few quiet murmurs moved through the gallery. I continued. That's why, during our marriage, I began documenting patterns. Not arguments. Patterns. Victor shifted uncomfortably. Patterns of exclusion. I went on. Patterns of delay. Patterns of reassurance followed by secrecy. Daniel scoffed. You're exaggerating. I didn't look at him. I reached into my folder and pulled out a thin stack of papers. These are monthly summaries I created, I said, handing them to the bailiff. Dates I requested access. Dates I was denied. Explanations I was given. Judge Patterson skimmed the top page. Her expression changed. These notes begin 4 years ago, she said. Yes, I replied. Around the time Mr. Monroe began consolidating accounts. Daniel leaned toward Victor, whispering sharply. Victor stood. Your Honor, these notes are self-created. They're not evidence. They're contemporaneous records, I answered. And they align with the bank statements already admitted. Judge Patterson nodded slowly. I'll allow them. Daniel's shoulders tightened. I took a breath and continued. Your Honor, Mr. Monroe wants this court to believe that I'm standing here without counsel because I'm incapable. Daniel smirked again, a reflex he hadn't yet learned to control. The truth, I said, is that I needed him comfortable. Victor frowned. Comfortable? Yes, I replied. People reveal more when they're not threatened. Judge Patterson looked directly at Daniel. And were you comfortable today, Mr. Monroe? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yes. That single word landed hard. Thank you, I said quietly. I turned one more page. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce an email sent by Mr. Monroe to Victor Lang the night before this hearing. Victor stiffened. That communication is privileged. It was forwarded, I said. Again. Judge Patterson's eyes sharpened. To whom? To me, I replied. Daniel's face drained of color. The email was simple. Short. Dangerous. She can't afford a lawyer. Push hard early. The courtroom went silent. Judge Patterson read it once. Then again. Victor slowly sat down. Daniel shook his head, voice rising. That's being misread. No, the judge said calmly. It's being read. I closed my folder gently. Your Honor, I'm not asking the court to punish my husband. Daniel exhaled, relieved too soon. I'm asking the court, I continued, to recognize intent. Because intent explains everything we've seen today. Judge Patterson leaned back, hands folded. The room waited. And I realized something then, watching Daniel grip the edge of the table like it might keep him upright. He hadn't lost control because I was smarter. He'd lost control because he believed I wasn't. And as the judge looked down at her notes and said, "We're not finished here," I knew the next phase wouldn't be about what Daniel said. It would be about what the record now proved. The courtroom didn't move. No papers shuffled. No whispers dared escape. Judge Patterson looked up from her notes and fixed her eyes on Daniel. "Mr. Monroe, the record is starting to suggest something very specific." Daniel straightened again, forcing confidence back into his posture. "Your Honor, this is turning into a character attack." "No," the judge replied calmly. "It's turning into a credibility review." Victor stood quickly. "Your Honor, if the court has concerns, perhaps we should redirect to asset division." I shook my head gently. Asset division only matters if the disclosures are truthful. Daniel laughed, a short, sharp sound meant to dismiss me. "You're acting like you planned this whole thing." I met his eyes. I did. The laughter died instantly. A ripple ran through the gallery, sharper than before. Judge Patterson leaned forward. "Ms. Monroe, clarify what you mean." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I plan to represent myself. I plan to appear unprepared, and I planned for Mr. Monroe to feel confident enough to speak freely." Daniel stood up halfway. "This is absurd." The judge didn't look at him. "Sit down, Mr. Monroe." He did. I continued, my voice steady. "I didn't freeze my assets because I was afraid. I froze them because I wanted to remove temptation." Victor frowned. "Temptation?" "Yes," I said. "The temptation to hide things more carefully." Daniel shook his head. "You're twisting everything." I opened my folder again, revealing a single page. "Your Honor, this is a comparison chart." Judge Patterson gestured for it. "It compares Mr. Monroe's sworn financial statement with bank activity that occurred within 48 hours of filing." The judge scanned the page slowly. Her expression hardened. "These amounts don't match," she said. Daniel leaned forward, voice rising. "Because timing matters." "Yes," I replied quietly. "It does." I pointed gently to the page. "These transfers occurred after he certified full disclosure." Victor whispered urgently to Daniel now, his confidence gone, his voice tight. Judge Patterson looked up. "Mr. Monroe, do you understand the seriousness of sworn misrepresentation?" "Yes," Daniel said quickly. "Then explain it," she replied. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I trusted my advisors." I nodded. "That's interesting." Victor snapped his head toward me. "Because in an email sent 3 days later," I continued, Mr. Monroe wrote, "I don't want advisors involved in this part." The judge's pen stopped moving. Daniel froze. Victor whispered, "Daniel, what did you send?" I handed the email forward. Judge Patterson read it once. Then a second time. The room felt smaller somehow. Judge Patterson looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Monroe, the court is now considering whether your testimony has been intentionally misleading." Daniel's voice cracked. "That's not fair." The judge didn't raise her voice. "Fairness depends on honesty." I closed my folder slowly. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that the court note a pattern of concealment under oath." The judge nodded once. "Noted." Daniel stared at me now, not angry, not mocking, but afraid. Because he finally understood the truth. This wasn't a divorce, where money decided the winner. This was a record. And it was no longer going to forget him. Daniel's confidence didn't collapse all at once. It cracked in small, visible ways. His foot tapped too fast. His hands folded, then unfolded. His eyes kept flicking toward Victor like he was waiting for instructions that never came. Judge Patterson leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Lang," she said evenly, "does your client wish to revise his testimony?" Victor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client maintains that any discrepancies were unintentional." I lifted my eyes. "May I respond?" The judge nodded. Briefly. Unintentional doesn't explain preparation, I said calmly. And preparation is documented. Daniel shook his head. You're making it sound criminal. I'm making it sound intentional, I replied. A low murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Patterson tapped her pen once. Ms. Monroe, what do you believe Mr. Monroe intended? I took a slow breath. To control the narrative, and to present himself as transparent, while moving assets beyond reach. Daniel laughed weakly. You can't prove intent. I nodded. Not with one document. Victor exhaled, relieved too soon. But with a sequence, I continued. You can. I opened my folder again and removed a color-coded chart. Your Honor, this is a transaction map. The judge gestured for it. It shows timing, I explained. When funds moved, when disclosures were filed, and when communications were sent. Judge Patterson studied the chart in silence. Daniel leaned forward, voice rising. This is selective. I looked at him. It's complete. The judge's eyes moved back to Daniel. Mr. Monroe, did you authorize these transfers personally? Yes, he said. And did you do so knowing they were not disclosed? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The room inhaled sharply. Victor closed his eyes. I didn't speak. I let the admission sit where it belonged. Judge Patterson straightened. Mr. Monroe, that answer changes the posture of this hearing. Daniel's voice wavered. It was advice. From whom? The judge asked. Daniel glanced at Victor. Victor stiffened. Your Honor. Judge Patterson raised a hand. I didn't ask you, Mr. Lang. Daniel swallowed. I don't remember. The judge's expression hardened. Convenient. I stepped forward slightly. Your Honor, I'd like to submit one more exhibit. Victor looked at me sharply. How many do you have? As many as it takes, I replied. I handed over the final document for the day. This is an internal memo from Monroe Holdings, instructing staff not to discuss certain transfers. Judge Patterson read it slowly. Her jaw tightened. Daniel whispered urgently to Victor, Panic, clear now. The judge placed the memo on the stack and looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Monroe, the court is now evaluating whether this matter extends beyond marital dissolution. Daniel's face went pale, because he knew what that meant. This was no longer about who got what. It was about consequences. The word consequences hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Daniel shifted in his seat like the chair had suddenly turned against him. Your Honor, he said quickly, this is still a family court matter. Judge Patterson's voice stayed calm. Family court does not excuse sworn misrepresentation. Victor finally stood again, his confidence gone now, replaced by urgency. Your Honor, my client would like a brief recess to consult. I spoke before the judge could answer. Consult about what? Victor shot me a warning look. Because the record is already set, I continued quietly. A recess won't change what's been said under oath. Judge Patterson considered this, then nodded. Request denied. Daniel's shoulders dropped. I opened my folder again, slower than before, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to feel it. Your Honor, I said, I want to clarify something important for the court. The judge gestured for me to continue. I'm not asking for an unequal division of assets today. Daniel blinked. You're not. No, I replied. I'm asking for accuracy. Judge Patterson leaned forward slightly. Because once accuracy is established, I continued, division becomes math. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the room. Daniel laughed nervously. You think this makes you clever? I met his eyes. No. I think this makes you exposed. Victor rubbed his forehead. I turned another page. Your Honor, earlier Mr. Monroe stated he relied entirely on advisors. Yes, the judge replied. I'd like to revisit that claim, I said. Specifically, his direct involvement. I lifted a printed message thread. These are instructions sent by Mr. Monroe himself, not advisors. Judge Patterson read aloud one line. Move funds in stages, so nothing spikes. She looked up. Mr. Monroe, did you write this? Daniel's voice cracked. Yes. The courtroom felt like it had tilted. Victor whispered, Daniel, stop talking. But Daniel didn't. I was trying to protect myself, he said desperately. She was going to take everything. I nodded slowly. So, you moved things first. Daniel froze. Judge Patterson set the paper down. Mr. Monroe, thank you for your honesty. The way she said it made his stomach drop. Ms. Monroe, she continued, do you understand what you're asking this court to consider? Yes, I replied. That the integrity of this proceeding matters more than speed. The judge nodded. It does. Daniel leaned back, eyes wide, breathing shallow, because he finally understood what he'd done. By laughing at me, by underestimating me, by assuming poverty meant ignorance, he had given me exactly what I needed, time. And as Judge Patterson gathered the exhibits and said, the court will review these carefully, I knew the next session wouldn't be about questions. It would be about decisions. Decisions that would follow Daniel long after this divorce was over. The court recessed for lunch, but no one in that room felt hungry. Daniel stayed seated long after everyone else stood, staring at the table like it might offer him a way out. Victor gathered his files with shaking hands, whispering urgently, but Daniel barely seemed to hear him. I walked out alone. No celebration. No glance back. In the hallway, the air felt different, lighter, like the building itself knew something had shifted. I leaned against the wall for just a moment, not from weakness, but from release. When court resumed, Judge Patterson returned with a different energy. Calmer. Sharper. She looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Monroe, before we continue, the court needs clarity. Daniel straightened, forcing himself to appear composed. Yes, Your Honor. You have acknowledged undisclosed transfers, intentional timing, and direct instruction, she said. Do you maintain that these actions were lawful? Victor opened his mouth. Judge Patterson raised a finger. I asked Mr. Monroe. Daniel swallowed. Yes. The words sounded thin. I stood again. Your Honor, may I proceed? She nodded. Go ahead, Ms. Monroe. This morning, I said, Mr. Monroe laughed when he saw I was representing myself. A murmur rippled through the gallery. He believed that meant I was unprepared. I continued. What it actually meant was that he was. Victor scoffed weakly. That's rhetoric. It's context, the judge replied. I turned one last page in my folder. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a certification. The judge's eyebrows lifted. From whom? From an independent compliance officer, I replied. Prepared 6 months before separation. Daniel stiffened. Judge Patterson reviewed the page carefully. This outlines risk indicators and recommended disclosure corrections. Yes, I said, which Mr. Monroe ignored. Victor whispered urgently to Daniel now. Panic clear. The judge looked up. Mr. Monroe, were you advised to correct these disclosures? Daniel's voice dropped. Yes. And you chose not to? Yes. The courtroom went silent. Judge Patterson closed the file gently. Then the court has no choice but to escalate its review. Daniel shook his head, disbelief and fear colliding. Escalate how? The judge met his eyes. This court will refer the record for further examination. Daniel's breath hitched. Victor's face went pale. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because the moment I had waited for was finally here. And as Judge Patterson added, this hearing is no longer limited to asset division. I realized something profound. I hadn't won by out-arguing my husband. I had won by letting him speak. And whatever came next would be far louder than his laughter ever was. The word refer echoed louder than any gavel strike ever could. Daniel sat frozen, eyes locked on Judge Patterson like he was waiting for her to take it back. Victor leaned in close, whispering rapidly now, not strategy. Damage control. Judge Patterson adjusted the stack of papers in front of her. Ms. Monroe, she said, the court needs to understand something clearly. Yes, Your Honor. You chose to represent yourself knowing the complexity of this case. Yes. And you understood the risks? Yes. She studied me for a long moment. Why? I answered without hesitation. Because complexity hides patterns. Simplicity reveals them. The courtroom went still. Daniel laughed weakly, shaking his head. She's rehearsed this. No, Judge Patterson replied calmly. She's prepared. Victor stood abruptly. Your Honor, we object to further testimony without counsel present for Ms. Monroe. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Lang? She is counsel. A ripple moved through the room. I took a slow breath. Your Honor, I'd like to clarify one more point for the record. She nodded. Mr. Monroe has suggested repeatedly that I lacked access because I didn't understand financial structures, I said. I'd like the court to note that I was excluded after I began asking informed questions. Daniel snapped. That's not true. I turned to him. Then explain why my access was revoked the same week I requested compliance summaries. Victor whispered urgently. Daniel, don't. Daniel cut him off. Because you were accusing me. I nodded. Exactly. Judge Patterson looked up sharply. Accusing him of what? Daniel hesitated. Too long. Of hiding things, he said quietly. The judge's pen stopped. So, she said, you revoked access because you believed she was onto something. Daniel's shoulders sagged. Yes. The admission landed hard. I closed my folder gently. Your Honor, that is intent. Judge Patterson nodded slowly. It is. She turned to Victor. Mr. Lang, the court will require a full accounting from your client. Victor swallowed. Understood. And, she continued, any further misrepresentation will carry sanctions. Daniel's face drained of color. I remained standing calm, grounded, aware that the balance had fully shifted now. There was no laughter left in the room. No arrogance. Only consequence. As Judge Patterson prepared to adjourn, she looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Monroe, you underestimated the seriousness of this proceeding. Then she looked at me. And, Ms. Monroe, you understood it completely. The gavel came down once. Not loud. Final. And as everyone began to rise, I realized something quietly powerful. This hearing had stopped being about what I could prove. It was now about what he could explain. And that was a position Daniel had never prepared for. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the silence. Daniel stayed seated again, staring at the table, no longer angry, just exposed. Victor packed his briefcase with sharp, nervous movements, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. Judge Patterson rose, paused, then looked back once more. Mr. Monroe, she said calmly, be advised. Anything submitted from this point forward will be examined in full. Daniel nodded without looking up. When the doors closed behind her, the sound echoed louder than the gavel ever had. In the hallway, whispers followed me. Not pity this time. Not judgment. Curiosity. People wanted to know who I was. And how I'd done it. I didn't answer. Because the truth was simpler than they expected. I'd paid attention. When court resumed later that afternoon, the tone had changed completely. No jokes. No smug smiles. No casual objections. Victor spoke only when necessary, careful now, measured, like a man walking across thin ice. Judge Patterson reviewed the new filings silently, page by page. Then she looked up. Mr. Monroe, she said, this court has reviewed the preliminary accounting. Daniel straightened slowly. Yes, Your Honor. The numbers do not reconcile, she continued. Not marginally. Substantially. Victor inhaled sharply. I remained still. You will submit a corrected accounting within 72 hours, Judge Patterson said. Failure to do so will result in immediate sanctions. Daniel nodded. Understood. She paused, then added, additionally, the court is ordering a neutral compliance review. Victor looked up sharply. A review? Yes, the judge replied. Independent. Daniel's voice cracked. That won't be necessary. Judge Patterson met his eyes. It is now. I felt the shift ripple outward again. Because an independent review doesn't just look for mistakes. It looks for patterns. As the judge continued outlining deadlines and disclosures, I realized something quietly astonishing. Daniel was no longer defending himself. He was reacting. Every word from the bench pushed him further into a corner he'd built himself. When the session finally adjourned, Daniel stood and turned toward me, desperation creeping into his expression. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "No," I replied. "It's just accurate now." He looked away. I walked past him without another word, the sound of my footsteps steady, controlled, no longer carrying the weight of being underestimated, because the truth had already done its work. And as I stepped outside into the fading light, one thought stayed with me. The next phase wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be theatrical. It would be methodical and far more dangerous for him. The independent review began quietly. No announcements. No press. That was the most dangerous part. Daniel called me that night, for the first time in weeks. I let it ring. He texted instead. "We should talk." I didn't reply. By morning, the compliance team was already at work, requesting records, timestamps, authorizations, everything Daniel had assumed would never be looked at together. Victor called next. "Rachel," he said carefully, "this is getting bigger than expected." I smiled faintly. "That usually means it was always big," I replied and ended the call. In court later that week, Judge Patterson reviewed the first findings. "Mr. Monroe," she said evenly, "the compliance review has identified discrepancies across multiple reporting periods." Daniel stood, his confidence completely gone now. "I'm working to correct them." "These are not clerical errors," the judge replied. "They are structured." The word hit him harder than any accusation. I remained seated, hands folded, letting the professionals do what they did best. The compliance officer spoke next, voice calm, unemotional. "Funds were moved in layers. Timing suggests concealment rather than oversight." Daniel shook his head. "That's interpretation." "It's sequence," the officer replied. Victor sat back slowly, realizing he was no longer steering anything. Judge Patterson turned to me. "Ms. Monroe, is there anything you wish to add?" "Yes," I said, standing. "Only that this review confirms why I represented myself." Daniel looked up sharply. "Because once this was on the record," I continued, "the truth didn't need me anymore." The judge nodded once. Then she said something that made Daniel's breath catch. "The court will be expanding the scope of this review beyond marital assets." Victor froze. Daniel whispered, "What does that mean?" Judge Patterson's voice was calm. "It means anything connected to these transfers is now relevant." Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with clarity. He had spent years controlling information, separating truth into neat, manageable pieces. Now, everything was being connected. And as the judge set new deadlines and adjourned, I realized something undeniable. Daniel hadn't lost because I trapped him. He lost because he underestimated how dangerous transparency could be. And as I walked out of the courtroom again, the weight on my chest eased even more. Because the end was no longer uncertain. It was approaching. The expanded review moved faster than anyone expected, because once patterns appear, they pull everything toward them. Daniel arrived late that morning, tie crooked, eyes tired, confidence gone. Victor followed a step behind, quiet now, careful with every word, like he knew one more misstep could make things worse. Judge Patterson took the bench and didn't waste time. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "the court has reviewed the supplemental findings." Daniel nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." "The review identified coordinated transfers across entities you personally controlled," she continued. "Those transfers occurred shortly before and after sworn disclosures." Victor stood. "Your Honor, we object to—" "Sit down," the judge said calmly. Victor sat. The compliance officer returned to the stand, laying out timelines that overlapped perfectly with Daniel's testimony. Dates aligned. Emails matched. Instructions traced back to him. This wasn't reactive, the officer said. It was planned. Daniel's voice rose. That's speculation. It's sequence, the officer replied again. I felt the room tighten. Judge Patterson turned to me. Ms. Monroe, the court has a question. Yes, Your Honor. You requested this review, knowing where it would lead. Yes. Why? I met her eyes. Because money can be replaced. Integrity can't. Daniel laughed once, bitter and hollow. You're enjoying this. I shook my head. I'm ending it. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Monroe, the court is now considering sanctions beyond financial adjustment. Daniel's face went pale. Those considerations include fee shifting, asset restraint, and referral, she continued. Referral to what? Daniel asked, his voice barely steady. Judge Patterson didn't raise her voice. To authorities who evaluate intent beyond this courtroom. Silence crushed the room. Victor closed his eyes. Daniel whispered, This was just a divorce. I stood slowly. It stopped being just a divorce the moment you laughed and assumed I was harmless. Judge Patterson nodded once. Ms. Monroe is correct. The judge gathered the files, then looked directly at Daniel. The court will issue interim orders today. Daniel swallowed hard. As the gavel came down, I realized something final. He had spent years controlling outcomes by controlling perception. But the moment perception shifted, outcomes followed. And as court recessed again, with Daniel staring straight ahead, unmoving, I knew the next phase wouldn't be about evidence anymore. It would be about consequences. And they were already in motion. The interim orders came down quietly, but their impact was anything but. Judge Patterson spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had seen this pattern before. Effective immediately, she said, the court is issuing a temporary restraint on all accounts connected to Mr. Monroe. Daniel's head snapped up. All accounts? Yes, the judge replied. Personal, corporate, and derivative. Victor stood halfway, panic breaking through his composure. Your Honor, this will paralyze my client's operations. That, the judge said evenly, is not the court's concern. Daniel's breath came shallow now. You're punishing me before a final ruling. No, she said. We're preventing further damage. I stayed seated, hands folded, letting the weight of the moment land where it belonged. The judge continued. Additionally, due to the nature of the disclosures and sworn testimony, this court is ordering full fee shifting. Victor froze. Fee shifting. Yes, Judge Patterson replied. Mr. Monroe will be responsible for all legal and compliance costs incurred as a result of these proceedings. Daniel turned toward me, disbelief in his eyes. You did this. I met his gaze calmly. You did. The judge wasn't finished. Finally, she said, the court is referring the compiled record to external review. Daniel's voice cracked. External. Judge Patterson looked directly at him. This court does not determine criminal liability, but it does not ignore indicators. Silence crushed the room. Victor sank back into his chair. I felt the shift settle completely now. There was no arguing left. No strategy. No clever reframing. Only consequence. As the gavel fell, Daniel remained standing, frozen, like his body hadn't caught up to what his mind already knew. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, voices rising, cameras flashing, hungry for spectacle. I walked past them without stopping, because the story wasn't about headlines. It was about precision. And as I stepped into the light, I realized something quietly powerful. I hadn't taken anything from Daniel. I had simply let the truth take its place. The days after the interim orders felt unreal, not chaotic. Just sharply quiet. Daniel tried to call again. I didn't answer. Victor sent an email, careful, almost respectful now, asking if I would consider mediation. I read it once, then archived it. There was nothing left to negotiate. When court resumed, Daniel looked smaller somehow, like the weight of frozen accounts and open investigations had finally settled onto his shoulders. Judge Patterson opened the session with a single sentence. The court has reviewed the updated disclosures. Daniel stood automatically. Yes, Your Honor. They are incomplete, she said. Victor closed his eyes. The compliance officer spoke again, laying out additional findings, offshore linkages, layered entities, transactions that no longer looked clever. Just obvious. Daniel's voice trembled. I disclosed everything I could. Judge Patterson didn't flinch. Then everything you could disclose was insufficient. I remained still, listening, watching, aware that the room no longer needed me to guide it. Mr. Monroe, the judge continued, the court has received confirmation that external agencies have opened preliminary inquiries. Daniel's knees visibly weakened. Victor whispered urgently, Daniel. The judge raised a hand. No further argument. She turned to me. Ms. Monroe, the court recognizes the unusual posture of this case. Yes, Your Honor. You represented yourself, she continued, not because you lacked resources, but because you understood leverage. Daniel stared at me now, something close to disbelief in his eyes. Judge Patterson nodded once. That understanding changed everything. She leaned forward slightly. This court will issue its final ruling at the next session. Daniel's breath hitched. I felt something settle inside me. Final? As people began to rise, Judge Patterson added one more line. Not loud, but unmistakable. Until then, all restraints remain in place. Daniel sank back into his chair. I gathered my folder and walked out slowly, each step steady, deliberate, no longer carrying the weight of being doubted. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent to courtroom drama. But I wasn't the same woman walking into it. Because the moment Daniel laughed at me, he handed me time. And time, when used well, becomes power. The final hearing arrived without ceremony. No whispers, no laughter, just inevitability. Daniel stood when Judge Patterson entered, but the confidence he once wore like armor was gone. His shoulders were slumped now, his eyes dull, the posture of a man who knew the ending was no longer his to shape. Victor didn't speak at all. Judge Patterson opened the file one last time. This court has reviewed all disclosures, compliance findings, and external assessments. Daniel swallowed. The evidence establishes a consistent pattern of intentional concealment, sworn misrepresentation, and strategic obstruction, she continued. Not once, but repeatedly. I stood quietly, hands folded, listening. Mr. Monroe, she said, you were given multiple opportunities to correct the record. You chose not to. Daniel nodded faintly. The court finds that Ms. Monroe acted in good faith at every stage of these proceedings. She turned toward me, including when she chose to represent herself. Daniel closed his eyes. The court's final ruling is as follows, Judge Patterson said. The room leaned forward. All restrained assets will remain frozen pending final division. Full forensic accounting costs will be borne by Mr. Monroe. Ms. Monroe is awarded primary control of all jointly held business interests. Daniel's breath broke. And, the judge added, the record compiled here will remain available to external authorities. Victor lowered his head. The gavel came down. Final. Daniel didn't look at me as deputies approached to escort him out for further processing related to the referral. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He just walked. I stayed seated until the room cleared, feeling the quiet settle fully now. No tension left to release. When I finally stood, Judge Patterson looked at me one last time. Ms. Monroe, she said, you understood the law better than most who practice it. Thank you, Your Honor, I replied. Outside, cameras flashed, voices called out, but I didn't stop. Because the victory wasn't public. It was internal. I hadn't proven I was smarter than my husband. I had proven that underestimation is dangerous. And as I walked away from the courthouse, sunlight warm on my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Earned. And unafraid. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, almost unsure of itself at first. The morning after the final hearing, I woke up before my alarm, not from anxiety, but from habit. For a few seconds, I lay still, waiting for the familiar tightness in my chest. It didn't come. Instead, there was space. Calm, the strange feeling of a life no longer bracing for impact. The company emails started early. Not congratulations. Not apologies. Just confirmations. Transfers initiated. Authorities notified. Systems resetting themselves now that the truth had a place to land. Daniel didn't contact me again. Victor didn't either. Silence had finally replaced pressure. Later that week, I returned to the office building I had avoided for years, the same one Daniel used to treat like his personal kingdom. The lobby felt different now, lighter, as if the walls themselves had been relieved of a secret. People looked at me differently. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. With recognition. A senior manager stopped me near the elevator. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "But we see it now." I nodded. That's enough. The forensic team wrapped up their work methodically, not rushing, not dramatizing. Numbers were corrected. Structures simplified. Truth reassembled piece by piece. At home, I packed away the last remnants of my marriage. Not angrily, just decisively. Papers filed. Photographs boxed. A chapter closed without ceremony. One afternoon, as I poured myself coffee, I paused. Just for a moment. Not from fear. From awareness. I smiled and took a sip. Nothing happened. And that was the victory. That evening, I received a handwritten note from Judge Patterson's clerk. Inside was a single line. "The court respects preparation." I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Because what saved me wasn't brilliance. It was patience. It was noticing patterns. It was refusing to believe that laughter equals power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood by the window and watched the city lights come alive, steady, predictable, honest. And I understood something deeply now. I hadn't won because I spoke louder. I won because I spoke when it mattered. And as night settled in, I felt the story approaching its final breath. Not an ending filled with noise, but one built on something far stronger. Peace. The story didn't end in the courtroom. It followed me into ordinary days. Grocery lists. Morning light. Quiet evenings where nothing needed defending. That was the real victory. A week later, I received a message from someone I didn't recognize. A woman. Short. Direct. "I watched your hearing. I didn't know women could do that." I read it twice. Then I replied. "We always could." The company continued its slow, careful rebuild, not driven by ambition, but by integrity. Processes changed. Safeguards strengthened. Transparency became routine instead of optional. I didn't need to announce anything. The culture shifted on its own. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old drawer, I found the notebook I'd kept during my marriage. Dates, times, small observations that once felt insignificant. I flipped through the pages slowly. This wasn't paranoia. It was awareness. And awareness, I realized, is often dismissed as anxiety, until it's proven right. I thought back to that first moment in court, the laughter, the whispers, the way people decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. They weren't cruel. They were comfortable. Comfort breeds assumptions. And assumptions create blind spots. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at the table, letting the memory pass through me without weight. If I could speak to the woman I was then, the one standing alone in court, folder in hand, I'd tell her one thing. Let them laugh. Because laughter is loud, but preparation is permanent. As the evening grew quiet, I felt gratitude settle in, not for the outcome, but for the clarity it forced. Some battles don't require shouting. They require timing. And as I closed the notebook and turned off the light, I knew the final chapter wasn't about what I took from my husband. It was about what I gave myself. The right to trust my mind, my instincts, and my silence until it was time to speak. Life didn't become perfect after that. It became honest. I wake up now without rehearsing conversations in my head, without questioning whether noticing patterns makes me difficult, dramatic, or wrong. The world feels quieter, not because it has fewer problems, but because I no longer carry ones that were never mine to hold. Looking back, the moment that changed everything wasn't when I spoke in court. It was when I decided to wait. When I chose preparation over panic, records over reactions, truth over noise. That choice followed me into every part of my life. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if someone in your life laughs when you ask questions, if you're told you wouldn't understand, or that silence is safer than clarity, please hear this. Pay attention. Because being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's an opportunity. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, tell me in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest? And if you want more stories about quiet strength, real justice, and women who reclaim their power, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Because it's never too late to trust yourself and choose truth.